On September 28, 1874, in Palo Duro Canyon, Texas, U.S. troops opened fire and took down 500 Comanche horses in the blink of an eye. These weren't just animals, they were the strength and soul of the tribe. Centuries earlier, when Columbus brought horses to America in 1492, native people had no idea what they were, but the Comanche snatched them up and turned them into the backbone of their legend. Funny thing is, horses had been gone from this land for thousands of years before that. So how do the Comanche still feel them alive today? When horses were new, the image of Indians on horseback feels like it's been around forever, a picture we all know from stories and screens. But Native Americans didn't always have horses. In fact, before the 15th century, they'd never even laid eyes on one. That all changed in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed over and brought horses to America, kicking off something huge. These weren't just animals to the Europeans. They were a weapon, a way to take control. For the people already living here, it was a total game changer. Back then, life for Native Americans was all on foot. If you needed to move your camp or carry supplies, you'd walk, maybe get a couple of dogs to help pull a travois loaded with gear. Hunting meant tracking animals with nothing but your legs, a spear, or a bow. No fast rides to close the gap. Horses didn't exist in their world. Scientists say they'd been gone from North America for about 10,000 years, wiped out long before anyone could remember them. So imagine living your whole life, generation after generation, with no idea what a horse even looks like. That's how it was across the plains, the forests, everywhere, until those ships showed up. When Columbus landed in 1492, he didn't come alone. His ships carried horses, snorting and stomping, ready to step onto new land. The Spanish who came after him saw these animals as power on four legs. A rider in armor, charging with a sword or lance, could scatter anyone on foot in seconds. It wasn't about farming or travel for them. It was conquest, plain and simple. They started in places like the Caribbean, then pushed into Mexico, and by the early 1500s, horses were spreading north. For the native people watching this unfold, it must have been wild, huge creatures they'd never seen, hauling strangers who looked set on taking over. At first, it was probably terrifying. You're standing there with a wooden weapon, and this giant thing comes barreling towards you with a guy on its back swinging steel. But not everyone just froze. Some saw potential. The Comanche, especially, didn't let it stay a threat. They realized these horses could be more than something to fear. They could be a tool, a partner. While the Spanish used them to dominate, the Comanche and other tribes started figuring out how to turn the tables. They didn't have horses before that moment, not a single one, but once they got their hands on them, everything shifted. That famous image of an Indian on horseback isn't as old as you might think. It started right there, in the chaos of the late 15th century, when Europe crashed into America. Native Americans, like the Comanche, took what was brought to crush them and made it their own instead. Before 1492, their world had no hooves, no saddles, no riders cutting through the wind. After that year, though, the story changed fast. And what came next was bigger than anyone could have guessed. Horses brought to conquer turned to fight. In 1492, when Columbus first landed in the Americas, horses stepped off those ships with him. And that was just the start. Over the years that followed, Europeans, especially the Spanish, kept bringing more. Not as some friendly gift, but as a weapon of conquest. This was the colonial era, a time when they were dead set on claiming every inch of land they could. Horses gave them the upper hand. Imagine a Spanish soldier, armored up, charging across the plains on horseback with a lance or sword ready to strike. That kind of power wasn't just about getting around, it was about overwhelming anyone in their path. They started in the Caribbean, moved into Mexico, and by the early 1500s, those hooves were pounding northward, shifting the balance wherever they went. The Comanche and other native peoples saw this unfold, and they didn't just stand there. These horses were tearing across their land, carrying riders who wanted to take everything: their homes, their way of living, all of it. But instead of giving up, they turned it around. They adapted the horse into a powerful ally, something to fight back with and protect what was theirs. It wasn't a small thing either. It was about survival. They started snagging horses from the Spanish, raiding their camps, or picking off ones that got loose. Once they had them, it wasn't just about riding for the sake of it. These animals became their strength, a way to hold on to their land and keep their lives intact against the wave of outsiders. Riding a horse changed everything for the Comanche. A warrior on horseback could move fast, hit hard, and slip away before the enemy knew what happened. It made defending their territory a whole lot tougher for anyone trying to push them out. Hunting turned easier too. Chasing down game like buffalo became quicker when you weren't stuck on foot. Other tribes picked up on this as well, but the Comanche ran with it like nobody else. They didn't see horses as some fancy new trick. To them, it was a partner in the fight, a lifeline when everything they knew was under threat. What the Spanish brought to dominate, the Comanche flipped into a tool to resist. This shift didn't take long to spread. After 1492, as more Europeans pushed in, horses moved with them, escaping or getting traded across the land. By the time the Spanish were deep into their conquest, the Comanche and others were already making them their own. It was a bold move, taking something meant to crush them and using it to stand taller. Their way of life, the land they lived on, it all hung in the balance, and those horses gave them a fighting chance. That's how it started, and it set up a story that's bigger than anyone could have seen coming. The Comanche built power. The Comanche took horses and turned them into a real force to protect their land and culture. By the 18th century, they were the strongest mounted tribe on the southern plains. They got good at using horses to fight off anyone trying to take their territory, and it made them a big deal. They started grabbing horses from the Spanish in the early 1700s, and that's when things took off. One raid back then, a big success, gave them enough horses to change everything. They didn't just ride them. They used them to stay alive and keep their way of life going strong. That raid got carved into rock art, a story scratched into stone. It's not just a picture. It marks a moment when they pulled off something huge, probably in the early 1700s when they first hit Spanish camps hard. That's the start of what some call their empire on horseback. They ended up controlling a giant area called the Comanchería, about 240,000 square miles, stretching across parts of Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. With horses, they could ride fast, hunt buffalo easier, and keep that land theirs. It was a practical move that made them tough to beat. The rock art is one of hundreds of panels in a gorge, drawn by ancestors of people like Jane. It shows how they went from having no horses to running the show. That one raid wasn't the end. It kicked off years of taking more horses, building herds, and getting stronger. By the 18th century, they were raiding regularly, sometimes walking away with dozens or hundreds of horses in a single go. Those animals let them move quick, hit hard, and disappear, keeping settlers and soldiers on their toes. That's how they turned the southern plains into their turf and held it for over 100 years. Rock art and a new story. Hundreds of rock art panels sit in a gorge, scratched into stone by Jane's ancestors, telling the Comanche story loud and clear. These aren't just old drawings. They're a record of what went down, a way to keep their history alive. Each one shows something real, like warriors on horseback or moments that mattered. And it's amazing to see. The Comanche didn't just leave it there either. Their oral history, passed down through generations, backs up those images with tales of what happened. Together, these pictures and stories are flipping the script on what we know about Native America after the Europeans showed up. It's not the same old tale of defeat. It's about how they fought back and made their mark. One big piece of that is the first time the Comanche ran into the Spanish and their horses, probably between 1680 and 1700. Back then, Spanish expeditions were moving through the land, and their horses weren't always locked down tight. Some got loose, broke free from camps or herds, and started roaming the plains. That's when the Comanche got their chance. They didn't wait around for someone to explain it. They saw these animals and went for them. The rock art might be showing that exact moment, a pivotal battle where they seized horses from the Spanish. It wasn't a friendly trade or a gift. It was a fight, a grab for something that could change their whole future, and they won it. That battle, if that's what the art's about, set them up big time. Once they had horses, the Comanche took off, dominating the plains from the 18th century all the way into the mid-19th century. Those first horses they nabbed turned into herds, and those herds turned into power. A rider could cover miles fast, strike at enemies, and keep their land safe. The Spanish probably didn't see it coming, thinking they'd keep the upper hand with their animals. But the Comanche flipped it. They used horses to raid more, hunt better, and build a life that stretched across the land. That rock art could be a snapshot of the day it all started, when they turned a surprise encounter into a game changer. What's wild is how much this art and the stories shift the bigger picture. After European colonialism hit, a lot of native history got told one way. Outsiders came, took over, end of story. But these panels, carved by people who lived it, say something else. They show the Comanche adapting, fighting, and holding their own. The oral history fills in the gaps, keeping details alive that might have faded otherwise. Together, they're rewriting what happened, proving it wasn't just about losing ground. It was about taking something new, like those horses, and making it part of who they were. From around 1680 to 1700, when those first horses showed up, through the next 100+ years, they built something strong off that moment. Those hundreds of panels in the gorge aren't random. They're a map of the Comanche past, drawn by Jane's ancestors, showing how they handled the chaos of Europeans crashing in. That possible battle in the rock art isn't just a cool drawing. It might be the spark that lit their rise. They seized horses and ran with them, literally, all the way to controlling huge chunks of the plains. It's a story of grit, not just survival, and it's right there in the stone and the words they still tell today. The day the horses died. On September 28, 1874, everything crashed for the Comanche in Palo Duro Canyon, Texas. U.S. troops, led by Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie, rolled in and started shooting, not at people, but at their horses. Around 1,500 of them went down, slaughtered in one brutal sweep. These weren't just animals to the Comanche. They were their lifeline, their way to fight, hunt, and move. Losing that many in a single day didn't just hurt their resources, it broke their ability to keep going as they had. The canyon turned into a graveyard, blood soaking the ground, and the Comanche's whole world took a hit. They couldn't shake off. Mackenzie's plan was simple: take out the horses, and you take out the fight. It worked. The Comanche had been holding strong for years, using those horses to protect their land and way of life. But this was a blow they couldn't dodge. After that massacre, things unraveled fast. Less than a year later, on June 2, 1875, Quanah Parker, the last free Comanche chief, walked into Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and surrendered. He wasn't alone either. He brought about 400 of his Comanche people with him, the last holdouts of a once massive force. They'd been pushed to the edge, with their herds gone and their options running dry. The U.S. troops had been grinding them down, and that day in Palo Duro was the tipping point. Quanah didn't have much choice left. He led his people onto a reservation, ending a chapter that had kept them free and fierce for decades. This wasn't some random attack either. The U.S. wanted the Comanche out of the way, and they knew hitting the horses was the fastest way to do it. Those 1,500 horses weren't just a number. They were what kept the Comanche moving, fighting, and feeding their families. Without them, staying out on the plains got impossible. The Battle of Palo Duro Canyon wasn't a big clash of warriors. It was a calculated strike to cripple them. Mackenzie's troops rounded up the horses, shot them down, and left the Comanche scrambling. By the time Quanah surrendered, they'd lost more than just animals. They'd lost the power that had made them unstoppable. Quanah Parker's surrender marked the end of something huge. He'd been the last chief standing, leading the Quahati Band, one of the toughest groups in the Comanche Nation. They'd held out longer than most, dodging settlers and soldiers, living off the land with those horses. But after September 28, 1874, the math didn't add up anymore. With about 400 people left, he took them to Fort Sill, a military post where the U.S. could keep them boxed in. It was a hard call, but the slaughter of their herd left them cornered. The Comanche had built their strength on horseback, and when that was gone, the fight was over. Looking back, that day in Palo Duro ties straight to what the rock art hints at: a people who'd seized horses and made them everything. Now, the U.S. flipped it, using that same reliance against them. The 1,500 horses massacred in the Texas Panhandle weren't just a loss. They were a symbol of what the Comanche had been. Quanah's surrender, 9 months later, closed the door on their free days. But it didn't erase what they'd done with those animals for over a century. The Comanche keep going. The Comanche are still here today, not just hanging on, but thriving and proud of who they are. As of 2020, their population sits around 17,000 people, a solid number that shows they're far from fading away. After everything losing their horses, surrendering to reservations, they've kept their heritage alive. You can walk up to a Comanche person now and see it in them, that spark of a nation that's been through hell and come out the other side. They want folks to notice them and think, wow, that's a Comanche, not some dusty figure from a history book, but a living, breathing part of today. They're not stuck in the past. They're growing, strong, and holding tight to what makes them unique. At the center of it all is the horse. The spirit of the horse still beats in the heart of the Comanche Nation. Even now, those animals were everything back in the day: how they fought, how they hunted, how they lived free on the plains. Even after the U.S. troops wiped out their herds, that connection didn't die. It's baked into who they are, a thread that runs through their stories and their pride. You can't talk about the Comanche without talking about horses. It's like trying to tell a story without the main character. They took what the Spanish brought centuries ago and made it their own, and that bond stuck around, even when the horses themselves were gone. There's this belief they hold on to, something beautiful and haunting. When the moon is full, the Comanche say those Mustangs, the ones massacred in the Texas Panhandle, back in 1874, still run free. Picture it, a clear night, the moon lighting up the plains, and somewhere out there, the ghosts of those 1,500 horses thunder across the land. That's what they feel, what they know in their bones. Those were the horses gunned down in Palo Duro Canyon, the ones that left them reeling before Quanah Parker surrendered. But in their minds, those Mustangs didn't just vanish. They're out there, galloping under that silver light, a piece of the Comanche spirit that no one could kill off. It's a story they tell, a way to keep those animals alive, even after all these years. This isn't just some old legend either. It ties right into how they see themselves now. The Comanche today are proud of that past, of how they turned horses into power and held their ground for so long. That pride shows up in their community, in the way they carry their heritage forward. With 17,000 people strong, they're rebuilding, keeping traditions like that moonlit belief alive while living in the modern world. The horse isn't just a memory. It's a symbol of what they've been through and what they still are. They want you to see them, to get that they're not historical relics locked in a museum case. They're here, thriving, and that spirit of the horse is still running with them. The Comanche stand strong. The Comanche turned horses into more than just a ride. They made them a symbol of fighting back, staying alive, and knowing who they are. From 1700 to 1875, horses helped them resist anyone trying to take their land, kept them going through tough times, and shaped their identity. They started grabbing horses from the Spanish in the early 1700s and used them to hold their ground for over a century. Even after losing their herds in 1874, that horse spirit stuck with them. Hundreds of rock art panels in a gorge, drawn by Jane's ancestors, show how they survived European and American colonialism. Those carvings, along with stories passed down, prove they didn't give up. The art captures raids and battles, like the one that kicked off their rise, while the oral history fills in the rest. Together, they show the Comanche pushing through, from the Spanish showing up in the 1500s to the US, taking over later. Today, the Comanche want you to see them as a living nation, not some old history lesson. They're thriving, with about 17,000 people as of 2020, and they're proud of it. They don't want to be stuck in the past. They're here now, strong and real. They hope you'll look at them and think, that's a Comanche, not just a relic, but a community still going forward.